Chad, I think we have a few questions. Do you want to throw some out, please?
Absolutely. We have three questions teed up, and the first one's from Hendrik. How do you take care of yourself once you come back from the field? For example, mental health, preventing yourself from either becoming numb to what you witnessed or from falling into the rush of just wanting to go out again and again for its own sake. And how does the LA Times support you when it comes to that?
That was a good question. Well, it's a work in progress. We're still figuring that part out, the support part. But I've never been one to have known what therapy is, and I've never been to therapy most of my life until recently. In this last year, I checked myself in because I started to realize the burnout can be real, and I do oftentimes, like after coming back from Afghanistan, I realized like I just wanted to go back in, and even though I was exhausted, even though I was like worn out, and I thought going back in would re-energize me, and I realized that way of thinking is wrong. And I think that's when I checked into therapy and started to get help and figure out, like, how to mentally sort things. I got advice from actually Clarissa Ward at CNN, who was very forthcoming about how she deals with this stuff. And the idea is that for our jobs, we kind of have to compartmentalize the things, the horrors, the weight of the thing, of the things that people share with us. The trick is to compartmentalize, put it in a box, but never ever and sweep that box under under anything and put it away. To leave that box on the shelf somewhere and to collect and set aside time to really address, those boxes of things that you compartmentalize. So I think that's something I'm learning how to do, and I think the LA Times is now figuring out how to best support me in that sense.
I appreciate the honesty to that question. And I would also like to ask Calvin, because I think oftentimes as picture editors and as, leading photography departments, and hearing you even talk about, the level of stress that you felt knowing that Marcus was out there, I would also ask you that same question.
Yeah, for me, we've talked long. When he was in Ukraine, we talked about like because he was photographing all these gruesome things, the heart in the middle of the road that was blown from a Russian soldier, beheaded dead bodies on the railroad track, all that stuff. And I would say to Marcus, "Are you okay?" And he was very like, "Yeah, what's the problem?" And I'm like, "No, I mean, this is going to catch up to you." And Marcus was he was pretty stoic, right? You were like, "Hey, I've got a job to do," or but we talked a lot about like, we'll pay for your therapist, remember that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
and Marcus at the time would say, "I don't need one," that kind of stuff. But I think as the war grind on, and he had an experience that was probably the most terrifying experience for him and me. You want Marcus about the
Yeah, I at the second phase of the war, I stepped on a tripwire, and that set off a booby trap. And I mean, I had was in friendly territory, but it was a booby trap set by the Ukrainians for the Russians, that in case the Russians would ambush them from the river behind them. And they had forgotten all about it, and I had accidentally wandered into it. And fortunately for me, it was a a a
flash.
flashbang and not an IED. And I remember that moment played out in my head for several weeks. Like, that split second became
Yeah,
like more than minutes basically.
yeah,
And I was actually with a fellow photographer who was, roaming around with me for safety. And I remember that moment we looked at each other, and I felt the immense guilt of having placed that photographer next to me, and what, how that might have affected him too.
yeah.
So I think it was a very lucky. We were lucky to like have
Right.
to be okay.
Yeah.
But it was a very scary moment. I remember calling Calvin immediately and like, I just want you to
Yeah.
know before you find out anywhere, like, before you find out from anybody else, you got to
Yeah.
hear from me.
Yeah.
But then we continued on our coverage and kept working after that. And I think that day I immediately called my therapist and like
Yeah.
kind of worked out
Yeah.
the steps and how to pack this away and continue, how to be operational, basically.
Yeah, and we got really serious about like, okay, Marcus, you got to like take care of yourself. You need to come out. There's no point. There's that by that time the Ukraine war wasn't on the front page. It was more like the day in and day out. I like it's not worth dying for, Marcus, come out, take care of yourself, get some help and all. And he did, unlike Afghanistan, he actually says you're right, and he came out, and that's so that was good. Marcus is one of those young guns, right? Who thinks who I've always thought like he always felt like he was invulnerable, and the story was worth it and all. And I said, like, Marcus, you got a long career ahead of you. Don't just go into the fire every time,
Thank you. Chad, anything else in the chat?
Yeah, we have a few questions lined up here. This one's from Bill, who asks, how did you get out of Kabul? What was the scene? And are you in touch with any of the Afghan journalists who fled?
Good question.
I've left Afghanistan 2 months later. I was there and I left via a humanitarian flight organized by the Qatari government, and had to figure out a spot on their flight and was able to get out that way. I thought of staying much longer, but after finishing the reporting for that women's portrait story, I forgot to mention I also collaborated with a coworker, an amazing coworker, amazing writer, Laura King, who was also helping me guide and give me perspective of like what kinds of questions to ask. I'm not a woman. I'm not going to pretend to know what they're going through. And it's oftentimes when you're in this situation, it's good to get perspective, and it's important to reach out to people for help. And she was very, very gracious to like walk me through some of the more sensitive things. She was the former bureau chief in Afghanistan years ago and is familiar with the landscape there. And I have after I left, we needed to publish that. I don't think I could have done that while staying there. So I left, and I still keep in touch with the journalists who I met there, and I'm very good friends with some of them. Last year, for the anniversary, around the anniversary of the fall, instead of rushing back to Afghanistan, I chose to spend it with my driver who fled Afghanistan, to commemorate this moment with him, and then also chose to visit some of my journalist friends from Afghanistan, just to catch up and see what they need, how life is treating them. Some of them are in Maryland, some of them are in Virginia, some of them in New York. They're just spread out everywhere.
Chad, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes. Julian asks, what advice would you have for someone who's interested in photographing and reporting internationally?
I think that's a question I get asked a lot, and I oftentimes tell people, like, if before you do that, you've got to recognize what skill sets you need to have. I think, and it boils down to basic journalism. We need to oftentimes, before we run overseas, and I think Sandra, you can attest to this. In the beginning of my career, a lot of my friends were, the Arab Spring was happening, and a lot of my friends were buying one-way tickets to Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, like, and were launching their, you know, launching their careers, I guess. And I just simply didn't have the money, and also didn't feel like that was my story to tell. And I wanted to focus on my skills. I just didn't have the skill sets at that point. And I think it's important to know like that, to recognize that, and to build your skill set. So I think building chops is very, very important. Building, like, getting experience is very, very important. And you don't need like overseas experience to do overseas work. You need to have good journalism. So I think it's important to like find time to build that experience. Would be it your local newspaper, be it your, an online publication somewhere, anywhere these days. I mean, I don't know what the landscape looks like now for a young journalist, but I think you just need to spend time like doing gumshoe reporting and grinding, doing, kind of being in the mix of producing every day, and I'm glad I did that early on in my career, working in smaller publications and, and working in smaller newsrooms before coming to the Los Angeles Times. So I've had a lot of that perspective, and having worked from a newspaper that was like circulated at 10,000 all the way to the Los Angeles Times.
I'm so glad you pointed out the fact that it's important to be able to even cover the stories in your own backyard. I oftentimes think, young student journalists seem to think the only way they can make a name is overseas, but the US is so rich and full of diversity and diverse voices and diverse stories. And there's so many, picture editors such as you, Calvin, who are here and willing to mentor and to give people a chance, I would imagine too. So thank you for saying that. Calvin, do you have anything to add to that?